Hello and welcome to episode 14 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, in an exclusive interview about an extraordinary incident, I hear from Ava, a 19-year-old charity volunteer from Liverpool, who was visited at her home by counter-terror police, despite them telling her she hadn't committed a crime, then asked about her political views and warned to bite her tongue before posting online.
There was a knock on the door. It was two women in plain clothes, and then they said, "Are you Ava? We're here with Merseyside Police." And then when I got in alone with them, they start on, "We're here with counter-terrorism."
After that, I speak to Daniel Hannan, the Conservative peer and former MEP, on why we're failing to learn the lessons from lockdown, Labour's plans to abolish hereditary peers, and his view on the Conservative leadership contest.
I am less interested in what they say they would do as Prime Minister than in what they will do now as Leader of the Opposition.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with evangelical journalist Julian Mann on how Christians are being persecuted around the world and how the woke Western media is turning a blind eye.
It's that neo-Marxist woke mind virus that results in almost a blindness or unwillingness, really, to the plight of Christians.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. 1 minute, you're an ordinary 19-year-old working in a charity shop, posting on Twitter to a handful of followers. The next, you're being interrogated by counter-terror police in your living room and asked about your political views. Well, that's what happened earlier this month to my next guest, Ava, from the Walton area of Liverpool. Ava was never told that she had committed a crime when she was visited by officers from Counter-Terror Police North West and Merseyside Police, but as you'll hear, she suspects their questions about her right-wing views came as part of the government's Prevent programme to counter suspected radicalisation. Chilling as this may sound, it wouldn't be completely surprising. As Sir William Shawcross found in his review into Prevent last year, its approach to right-wing extremism has often proved, quote, so broad it has included mildly controversial or provocative forms of mainstream right-leaning commentary that have no meaningful connection to terrorism or radicalisation. Well, to tell her story, Ava, who'd prefer her last name wasn't shared, joins me now. Welcome to The Sceptic, Ava.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so Ava, before we get into any of this, just tell us a bit about yourself for our audience. So what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
I volunteer for a charity shop that is for a local hospice. And besides that, pretty much not an awful lot. Mostly the gym. I'm into art. I like watching old films. I'm with my family a lot of the time. Nothing like wild.
Okay, and so you're raising money for people who are at the end of their lives. But in terms of your political leanings, just tell us a bit about that.
I was always classed myself as, say, centre-right. I'm not fully right. I'm not left. I'm not centre. My leanings tend to be righter, but they've never been extreme on any end. I would class it more just as moderate and common sense, but clearly Merseyside disagrees.
Right. And what kind of content would you generally be watching online?
It's mostly things along the lines of the Lotus Eaters, Dan Wootton, Paul Joseph Watson. I've watched Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, Daily Wire, Jordan Peterson. Things along those lines, nothing like set in one way.
Okay, so fairly mainstream stuff there. And in terms of your own posting, what's the extent of that?
I class it as quite moderate. It's mostly reposts, but my own views that I say online are typically based around mass migration, unfairness of the law, and sometimes about the transgender movement, about how it seems to involve kids a little too much for my liking.
And so let's get into what happened that day then. This was a Thursday, the 5th of September, and you were at home. And just tell us what you were up to that day. I mean, this came out of the blue, didn't it?
Yeah, it was about 11:30 in the morning, and actually I'd pretty much just gotten up because I wasn't feeling too well. I think I was actually making a cup of tea and moaning to my mum about feeling not well. And then there was a knock on the door. So I go and answer it, and it was 2 women in plain clothes with lanyards. And to be honest, my first thought was, oh God, cold callers this early. And then they said, are you Ava? We're here with Merseyside Police. Don't worry, it's nothing bad. We just need to speak to you. So in my head, I was thinking, is someone being hurt? Am I a victim of something? I was like, oh my God, okay, yeah, come in. And then they asked, because I'm 18, if I'd be okay, 19, if I'd be okay speaking alone. And I was like, yeah, of course. And then when I got in alone with them, they start on, we're here with counterterrorism.
Okay, and so then they say they're with counterterrorism. And I mean, so what was your reaction to that?
I was taken aback, and they said that they have intel that I've been inciting violence online. And you sat there and you're like, what? Especially because people have been arrested for that recently. You're immediately like, whoa, what's going on? And so one of them starts talking, and I say, what have I actually said, though? She said, well, we can't tell you that. I was like, well, where have I said it? We can't tell you. How did it flag up then? We can't tell you. Which what makes me think that I've been reported by someone, that they don't actually have anything. Because if they had evidence that I was inciting violence, then why wasn't I arrested? Because one of the first questions I asked was, has a crime been committed? And they assured me, no crime. It's like, oh, well, okay, so I'm just here for, to be told stop thinking, essentially.
And just to go back for a second on this question of inciting violence, I mean, we spoke a bit about the kinds of tweets you were posting, but in terms of how many followers you had, I mean, I know that your number's blown up quite a bit now, but roughly how many followers did you have at the time? Do you remember?
It was exactly 67. Not a lot at all. Not quite a thread. So from there, they're talking to me and they ask me, what are your political beliefs? And I look back and I know everyone will be thinking, why did you answer? But in the minute, you're a bit shaken up. You're not really thinking that when I wish I'd recorded. But so I explained I'm right-leaning, and they asked in what regard, and I answered about the transgenders and the immigrants. And they said, okay, well, that's all, hot topics. Then they asked about if I ever went to any of the riots. And I said, no, I never went to any. They asked if I agreed with the riots, and I said, no, not at all. I think it was the wrong way to go about it. And they said, do you agree with the opinions of the rioters? And I said, well, I think they have a point that should be heard in their concerns, yeah. They asked if I condone violence. I said, well, obviously not. And they said something like, well, it's not obviously, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Then they started asking about my parents' political views, about, are your parents right-wing? What are their beliefs? And so in that moment, you're thinking, oh God, am I going to land my parents in it too now? Are they going to get in trouble because of me? So I answered, well, they're about similar to me, right-leaning, not, anything bad. And then there was this Roman helmet on a table next to one of them, and one of them turns to it and goes, that Viking helmet, is that your interest? And the biggest crime was that they thought it was a Viking helmet. It looked nothing like a Viking helmet if you've seen it. And so I said, no, it's Roman, and it's my dad's. He loves Roman history. And I pointed at the bookshelf and said, if you look on the bookshelf, there's a ton of Roman history books, as well as there's Das Kapital on there. There's all Russian history books. It's a huge mix of history on there. It's not like we've got Mein Kampf sitting on the table. So we're talking more. They ask, there's religious pictures and statues in the living room as well. And they ask me about my religion, like, are you a Christian? Is your family really religious? Which I thought that shouldn't really be a concern. But, we're in an English Christian country. But so I answered, I'm not overly religious. We just collect religious art, but I am Christian and my dad's atheist. They ask if I ever felt pressured into my views. They asked me what's made me right-wing, which I said it was partly the school system, because I feel they push an agenda on you into a left-wing ideology, and so naturally you kind of go the other way. And research, that's why research. I said, yeah. Then they spotted the samurai sword on the mantelpiece and said, due to new legislation, we may need to confiscate that because it's over 50 centimetres potentially with a curved blade. And I was like, well, hold on, that isn't even mine. That's my dad's. He's nothing to do with this. So they said, well, we'll call your mum. And then they spoke to her mum. They asked about it and said, it's a replica. It's the lowest grade possible. It was literally shipped into the country after this legislation, apparently.
And right, so your mum's in the house with you at this point, is she?
Yeah, she was in the whole time with me, but she didn't want to barge in, and because they're asking me if I feel I've been influenced, she doesn't then want to come in and overtake, so that's then going to look bad. Do you know what I mean? So they call my mum and they're asking about this sword. My mum explains it was a birthday present for him, he served his country, he's an ex-veteran, stuff like that. And then the police officer goes, well, does he have a gun licence? Right, no. So, well, most veterans have gun licences, which that's a completely baseless claim. There's no evidence for that anywhere. And most veterans have seen violence and don't want to continue that. I've never personally met a veteran with a gun licence. Everyone I've met with them has been a non-veteran. But, it's whatever. And then after a short debate with my mother and the police of how the law is handled, they then left with the sword. They gave no reference number for the visit, no receipt for the sword, no names, anything. They told us they would email us when they got back to the office, and then I think it was about 24 hours before we heard anything.
Okay, so you said originally you didn't even think they were police officers. I mean, they were wearing lanyards. And so what was the kind of tone of the questioning when they sat you down? Was it more towards interrogation, or perhaps something more like a sort of social worker type thing?
It came across, like a sort of good cop, bad cop thing, where one was very pleasant and the other was quite cold. It wasn't an interrogation. They were polite, but it was slightly condescending, was the kind of overall feeling.
Okay, so a couple of different questions. I mean, you mentioned you didn't think they were police officers to begin with. And what were the emotions going through your head when you were sitting down with them? And then also, just more prosaically, how long was this interview?
Oh, I guess about 20 minutes to half an hour. And as you're talking to them, at first it's just shock. Then it's paranoia, because they're not telling you what you've done. It's almost kind of it is like a Soviet police type thing of, we know what you've done, but you can't know, just, don't do it. And so then in your head is, well, I'll just stop doing anything. I'll stop saying anything, because if I don't know what it is, then it's too risky to say anything, which I think is kind of the point of the whole, thing with it. You start then, because you're trying to answer their questions while also think of, what have I said? What could I have said? And so you're kind of disorientated. You're not expecting it. You're stressed because, you've been accused of inciting violence, which so many people have been arrested for recently. It's what if I'm going to get arrested, Then they're asking about your parents and you're worried about getting them in trouble. Then they've taken your goddamn dad's sword. It's, oh my God, now my dad's been robbed. It's so many emotions in one go.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Okay, so just tell us a bit about your dad for a second. I mean, he seems like an interesting character. So he's a veteran, and he's also got a great interest in history and sort of various historical memorabilia.
Yeah, he was in the military for about 18 years roughly. He served in Northern Ireland. He was in Germany for about 4 or 5 years before the wall came down. He was out in Mozambique, which my mum actually spoke to them about. He was out in Mozambique with the, trying to broker peace in Mozambique with the guerrillas and all that. And he was a weapons instructor, which makes it also ironic that his sword was taken. And that was one of the arguments my mum had with them, of, so the government will pay him to go out with a weapon, but he can't have a replica. It's absolutely ridiculous.
And I mean, how is he feeling about having his sword taken?
We called him at work as soon as it happened, and he was laughing until we got to the sword. Then he started kicking off. What, my sword's gone? He wasn't bothered about me being questioned. That was quite amusing to him. It was the sword, and still pissed off about it, obviously.
But obviously this is quite a serious thing about police procedure here, right? And so, of course, they did eventually tell you they were counter-terror police, but they never actually told you that you'd committed a crime. And I know that you've been in conversation with Fair Cop about this. Do you think that the police officers involved in this acted as they were supposed to?
I think to not leave a reference number or a receipt for the visit is wrong, because when my mum called Merseyside police the next day, they said, well, there's nothing we can do without a reference number. So we couldn't even follow it up. And if it weren't for the help of the Free Speech Union or Fair Cop, there wouldn't be an awful lot we would actually know to do. I can't say they came in tyrants, and I understand they're following the law, but I think people's issues as well as mine is the unfairness of the law itself. that even if everything they did is lawful, it's the fact that it's lawful to do that to someone.
Okay, so we were talking before the show started about how you suspected that potentially the reason you're on their radar is that you've been referred to Prevent or some similar thing, and that someone somewhere thought you were some kind of extremist in waiting. And of course, they had said there hadn't actually been a crime that had been committed. And so did you get a sense that they were more interested in your sort of views and perhaps your mental state than they were in whether there had actually been an offence?
Yeah, because they said there was absolutely no crime. It wasn't even that they didn't know. They told me I have not committed a crime. So then you have to think, okay, so I haven't committed a crime, so they're here really to stop me doing what I'm doing, which is posting to 4 active Twitter users, which is not an awful lot in my opinion. I think potentially, based off the line of questioning, the reason they targeted me was I think they're going for people maybe under 25. They think it's unusual to have these views and think it could be swayed, and that if they tackle that, then they can squash a rising right-leaning side, because it's like typical of what it's like Germany and Russia and China did in World War II. You go after the youth because they're your up-and-coming voters, it's military, and as well, it's what the schools do even in England. If you can condition them to be one way young, then they're more likely to stay like that. You can't tackle an older generation, you've got to go for the youth. And so I think even though my parents are far smarter, know far more than me about any of this, they go for me because I'm going to be easier to intimidate, really.
Okay, and so on the question of the police taking an interest in your views, I mean, it's quite a strange thing for them to be asking, isn't it? Do you have right-wing views? And I mean, how did that make you feel? Because it's strange, isn't it? On the one hand, having to answer that, if you do have right-wing views, you don't want to say, well, no, I don't. But then maybe part of you wants to make them less suspicious. And, it's quite a difficult situation they put you in there, isn't it?
Yeah, because I've always been raised to stand up for something, even if it gets you in trouble, if it's the right thing and it's honest, like you'd rather stick to your principles than be like a man without any. And so it's in your head is, I'm not going to back down, I'm not ashamed of my views or who I am. But then we've got 2 police officers here with counter-terrorism. Is this going to be a bit of a stupid move? Obviously, in the end, I decided to just say it. The one that really worried me was when they asked about my parents' political views, because if I get in trouble, that's me, but I wouldn't want to be responsible for anyone else. And I think they know asking that question to someone about other people is immediately going to panic them. But I don't think really the police should necessarily be concerned with the political views of the public. It's not their job to be concerned with that. It's no one's job to be concerned with that. Unless I'm building a bomb in my room, there's no reason they should be concerned. But even if I was, my political view shouldn't matter. All that should matter is I've got a bomb in my room, which I don't, for record.
Right. Okay, so you've been in contact with Fair Cop, I know, and so that's Harry Miller, and he's the former police officer who retweeted a satirical poem about transgenderism in 2019 and was then investigated by police. The key thing he was told there, the quote that everyone's remembered, is, "We need to check your thinking." And that's kind of the paradigmatic example of the police taking an interest in people's views that really they shouldn't be. And did you think that, in your case, that they were there to check your thinking?
Well, yeah, especially when the quote that's gone out was when they said to me, just a hint of advice when you're online, bite your tongue and think before posting. Which I said, well, there's the reason for the visit, isn't it? That's the reason. Bite your tongue. And I don't think that's advice anyone should be told. It's like a check your thinking type thing. I think check your thinking is quite openly disgraceful for anyone to say bite your tongue can be taken in multiple ways, but it's not really the police's job to say, especially if I've not committed a crime. If no crime's been committed, then why should I bite my tongue?
And in terms of that, I mean, I know you've gained a lot of followers on X off the back of this, and what will be the effect of this on your willingness to post online? I mean, will it be chilling your speech?
No, I think situations like this only make people feel stronger about what they believe. And I'm not against the police as an institution whatsoever. I'm against how the police is being run and how the laws are right now. When it blew up, and that was really thanks to Harry Miller posting it, that blew it up. It was really stressful. I think I had notifications off for like 3-4 days in a row because it was just lagging constantly, it was so stressful overnight to deal with. But the support was, very, very much appreciated, just stressful. But no, it hasn't made me want to stop talking at all. It actually makes you angrier, hence why I posted it. That was one of the first things I did, told some of my friends about. I was like, right, well, I'm going back on Twitter and saying this then, seeing as you want me to not. But I told them, I said to them, the reason I started going great was because the schools are pushing an agenda. So them saying bite your tongue, they should have known that was never going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And just so we're very clear on what the quote was, can you give it to me precisely what you remember them saying?
It was, next time you're online, bite your tongue and think first before you say anything online.
Yes, very sinister. Okay, so you're not going to be biting your tongue too much. And in fact, here you are, you've got this platform. So is there anything you'd like to say, perhaps to Merseyside Police or to the government generally, now that you can?
I think what most people's outrage, including mine, isn't necessarily the police being concerned about extremists. I understand that. The issue is their attention seems to be misplaced. And they say they're doing this for the safety of the public, and they said they're taking the sword for the safety of the public. But you can't say you care about the safety of the public when you've released 17,000 violent criminals into the public. And you can't say you care about the public when you covered up the Rotherham grooming gangs. And you can't say you care about the public when the rioters were treated so differently to the Leeds riots. You can't say there's not two-tier policing, and you can't say you care about the public. And the people who are being mostly affected by this are women, children, and the working class. It's not, the politicians are so far removed from these working class inner cities, they don't see all the issues going on. It's not their women and children in danger. It's not their lives who are being made worse. Yeah, everything they're doing is making women and children more in danger by releasing domestic abusers through mass migration. And they're making working class, and even to a point, lower middle class lives harder. And then preaching of how you should feel and how you should think when they're not the ones that's being affected. And I think anyone who's scared to say what they think shouldn't be, because I think there's a very silent, angry majority that at this point are too scared to say what they think but really shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, I should say 1,700 so far, not 17,000. But okay, so in terms of next steps, I know you've been in contact with the Free Speech Union and with Fair Cop. And is there any legal recourse for you, do you think, in this? And in particular, is there a way you're going to be able to get the katana back?
Well, we've already had an email saying we can't get it back. I think my dad's trying through connections. I'm not entirely sure. I highly doubt we can get it back. But, I guess we'll just have to find something else to go on the mantelpiece. I'm trying to find out through the help of Free Speech Union, which they've been great help, what it is that the police have on me. They said it's, not very likely they'll actually give it up, but I'm currently in the process of trying to find out because I would like to know and potentially get it cleared if possible. But in terms of getting the replica lowest grade sharpness sword back, that the demographic of knight crime isn't 60-year-old men with samurai swords. He's not putting on his Roman helmet and taking his sword out to the street shouting "De Volta" or something. That was such a big outrage because it's the demographic, that it's not the demographic committing knife crime. But they'd said as well that the issue was the length. So 50 centimetres that you can't conceal, you're not allowed. Well, you can have a smaller concealable one, that's fine. It makes no sense. No one is really being stabbed with a 50 centimetre katana. It's all these small hideable machetes. But what they're concerned about, no, you can't have a replica. Oh, sorry, it just winds me up. It's just stupid. But yeah, we're probably not getting it back.
It's perfectly understandable. And just in terms of that, do you think that they just sort of noticed it and they had to take it? I mean, what was the motivation behind taking it?
I know it's in the legislation because I did look it up afterwards. And I understand for their job they had to take it, but the reason they gave was this is what we're doing to combat knife crime. So this is what you're doing to combat knife crime. So at the riots, those people were told you can leave your machetes in the mosque. That's okay. That's great. You know, my mum will kill me, but when she took the sword off the mantelpiece, the woman got covered in dust because it's been up there for that long. And that is not combating knife crime. And then they said, you know, we're doing an amnesty, like, oh great, so all these criminals are just going to come and give up their weapons. You know, that's going to help so much, isn't it? This is going to help everything. You know, the issue with knife crime is 60-year-old men with replica swords. That's the issue. That is not helping knife crime whatsoever. Maybe releasing prisoners is going to increase knife crime, not samurai swords.
And just to come back to this one particular moment, so they see this, what actually to most people is very clearly a Roman helmet, but I guess they're not exactly history buffs here, and they say, is this a Viking helmet? And of course, we know that certain types of people try to portray an interest in Old English history as sort of a pipeline to or a signal of extremism. And in fact, there have been universities recently removing the term Anglo-Saxon from their curriculums in order to decolonize them because of its supposed association with the far right or white supremacy or whatever it is. So did you get the sense that this was partly motivating their concern with the helmet, even though it was in fact a Roman helmet?
Yeah, because there were a lot of things in the living room. It's not like a minimalist room. There's a hell of a lot of things shoved in there. And the two things they pointed out with this helmet and the religious stuff, which you've got to assume, and okay, so they're asking about things they're concerned about. Why would a Viking helmet be concerning? In obviously due to the, as you said, where they're trying to get rid of anything Anglo-Saxon, is that they think, all right, and they have an interest in their own history. How dare they? This must mean they are a concern. I think it's a slight outrage that anything Anglo-Saxon is classed as concerning. If that's not an obvious eradication of a native culture, then I don't know what is.
And so in terms of what's next for you, you'll be continuing your job at this hospice, will you? And how's this going to affect you going forward?
I'm continuing here for a bit and then I'm actually going to move on to something better because this is just voluntary. I was thinking maybe of writing like an article or something, not about what actually happened. People probably heard that to death, but maybe about how it personally affects people. Things like this happen, how it affects a society, and where things like this could lead to, and where it has done historically in the past, and similarities between what's happening now and what's happened in different countries through history, along those lines. But I'll have to see if I can actually get around to it and don't procrastinate.
Okay, well, Ava, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic and telling your story.
Thank you for having me.
Now, back in the dark days of early 2020, the Daily Sceptic, or Lockdown Skeptics as it was then known, was almost a lone voice in opposing the authoritarian madness of the COVID lockdowns. But one of those in the trenches with us was Daniel Hannan. The journalist and former MEP was appealing for calm amid the emerging panic as early as February, and he received plenty of flack for doing so. Well, he's now Baron Hannan of King's Clear, and today, as the COVID inquiry rumbles on, he's continuing to make the case for freedom from the red benches. So to discuss why we haven't yet learned the lessons from lockdown, and much more, I'm pleased to be joined by the ever erudite Lord Hannan now. Welcome to The Sceptic, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Thank you.
Okay, so the COVID inquiry continues, and there was a debate about this in the House of Lords recently that you gave a very highly regarded speech at. And one of the points at the start of that speech that you illustrated quite powerfully is that, well, obviously it's been more than 4 years since March 2020 when we had this national panic. And you'd think, therefore, that we'd now be a little better at, or more willing to, evaluate what happened there and say what went well and what didn't.
We are finding it difficult properly to relive the indignities and the horrors that we went through, from the grievous ones, the people unable to say farewell to dying loved ones, to the trivial ones, the debates about whether a Scotch egg counts as a meal. We've pushed all of these things, we've crammed them into some remote corner of our memory. In fact, the very difficulty of those things became an argument for continuing.
So to begin with, why is it so difficult for us to talk about what happened back in March 2020?
I think we're seeing a kind of repressed trauma. It's, I'm told, obviously I have no way of knowing whether this is true. Some of the female viewers can tell me, but I'm told that women can't recall the precise sensation of childbirth, right? And this is a kind of evolutionary necessity. I think we've been through something similar with lockdown. The sheer indignities and horrors of it, dye being poured into that lake in Derbyshire because it was a beauty spot, and the drones sent up to follow the solitary workers. And to the weirdness of the pingdemic, when we were all supposed to self-diagnose, and then, taking off our masks when we sat down at restaurant tables and putting them on again when we stood up, but the other way around in classrooms. I mean, the sheer sort of absurdity of it makes it very unpleasant to relive. And the only way that people can justify that to themselves is by saying it was for some higher purpose. We must have saved, millions of lives. And it's human nature to reason backwards from our hunches and our conclusions. And I'm afraid that's what people have done here, regardless of the evidence that's come in since.
Okay, and so that brings us on to another way of expressing this idea, which is the sunk cost fallacy. And you were saying that we very much fell into this way of thinking during the pandemic, with figures, including especially Matt Hancock, saying things like, well, we've done all this so far, so we can't make it look now like it's been for nothing. And so, why do you think we're so susceptible to the sunk cost fallacy as humans, I suppose, as a society? And what are the dangers of it?
Well, I'm not a behavioural psychologist, but the sunk costs fallacy is a very well observed phenomenon. It's a maladaptation to which all human beings are prone, and its consequences can be cataclysmic. Maybe to give the most catastrophic example, think of the First World War. If any of the participant combatant states had been able to foresee the cost of that conflict, none of them would have started. None of them. The idea of Italy, invading Austria to try and get a tiny bit of Alpine territory, if they'd been able to see what price they were going to pay. But once you have started, the very fact of the sacrifice becomes an argument for doing more. Otherwise, all of our young men will have died in vain. Are we going to dishonor their memory, right? And absolutely, that argument was being made in terms at the time by lockdowners, including by Matt Hancock, who made exactly that appeal. It would have all been for nothing if we stop now. And it's almost an admission that you've stopped making any kind of cost-benefit analysis. And I'm afraid, that this was, I think this was obvious to the handful of people who were skeptical at the start. Toby was one. I was another. I mean, and by skeptical at the start, I mean, in or before March 2020, loads of people joined in by the end of April, by the time we had the Swedish figures. But in those early weeks, Toby's had his share of controversies and he's had his share of criticism, but I suspect he would say, as I would, I have never had so much abuse, including from quite sane, normal people, as when I suggested that the lockdown was excessive. I think I may have been the very first, because I started criticizing the lockdown in February. I could see it coming. And not sort of online trolls, but people I knew were, oh my God, you're killing my granny, kind of thing. And I just think people got themselves into a state of mind from which it is very hard to reverse.
Okay, so in terms of our efforts to sort of grope our way towards reversing that state of mind a bit now, you mean with the COVID inquiry, how do you think that's going? I mean, are we learning the lessons from the lockdown years?
All right, you could infer everything you needed to know from that COVID inquiry, from the fact that it is the last place on earth where you are still required to take a COVID test before participating, right? As soon as I saw that, I knew where it was going to go. If that wasn't enough, the other giveaway was the institutionalization in the inquiry of the bereaved or other victim groups in every kind of combination, black women COVID victims or whatever. Now, the point about an inquiry is to be cool-headed, right? Never mind COVID. In any of these public inquiries, this is a hard thing that needs saying. Victims deserve our sympathy, but they do not have any special expertise as to the correct policy response. Indeed, they are, precisely because of their involvement, the last people who should be setting policy. And that should be a basic principle of any public inquiry, that it's there to be cool-headed, rational, and logical, right? it's the whole basis on which our criminal justice system works. If somebody assaults one of your children, you don't get to be the guy who decides on the suitable punishment, right? There are good reasons why we do this. And that also went out of the window. So even before it started, we could see where it was going. Then the list of questions go out, and they're all variants of, shouldn't you have been prepared earlier? Wasn't Brexit a terrible mistake? I mean, it's extraordinary that anyone is taking this seriously. And so, yeah, surprise, surprise, the predetermined result comes in saying, of course, we should have prepared earlier. A conclusion not sustained anywhere in the text of the body. So they kept on, in the body of the text, they kept on saying, and they put this in the kind of press summary, or not the press summary, in the introduction, that phrase about we prepared for the wrong pandemic. Absolutely nowhere is that justified in the evidence that they then present. Actually, in the same debate that I spoke in the Lords, Andrew Lansley, the former Health Secretary, made a very good speech in which he talked about the pandemic plan of 2011 and said, there was no evidence. No one at that time had given any evidence that closing schools would help in this kind of situation, or that face masks would work, or whatever. And he said, maybe we were wrong, but it is untrue to say that we prepared for the wrong pandemic. This would have still been, whatever the nature of the respiratory disease, this would have still been the plan. But actually, he was too polite to say it. There is no evidence that that was incorrect. There's no evidence that closing schools was effective. There's very, very tendentious evidence that face masks made a small difference at the margin. But the fundamental premise of that plan, which was, look, you can't stop this thing, so allow any disease to spread in a way that is timed so as to minimize fatalities, I haven't seen anything that's happened since to suggest that plan was wrong. Instead, far from not having a plan, the truth is we had a plan and we tore it up in a panic because we gave in to shrieking headlines and shrieking TV broadcasters.
Okay, and so how do you like the COVID inquiry to be different in an ideal world?
Well, look, I think there is only one question that should be asked, and that is, what is the efficacy of non-pharmaceutical interventions? We now have data. In 2020, we had only models, and people were guessing, and which is why, by the way, I've never. I mein, in contrast, I suspect, to a lot of your readers and viewers, I've never really been angry and vindictive about people who made a bad decision in a corner. I've been around politics enough to see why the incentives push them that way. But now that we do have the evidence, shouldn't that be the only topic that's being interrogated at this inquiry? Shouldn't we be bringing in all of these epidemiologists and virologists and public health officials and saying, here is now the data from all of these different countries. We can see all the different approaches. We can see what impact it has. Now what, right? No one's blaming you for working on models before when that's all you had. But now that we've got hard data, what would we do differently? And there doesn't seem to be any appetite to do that.
Okay, but what about more widely in the culture? I mean, obviously you mentioned that the inquiry itself has quite a monomaniacal focus, but is the debate changing more widely at all, especially with the example of Sweden?
Very little. I mean, okay, it has changed a bit, right? So I'm no longer getting the kind of death threats that Toby Young and Peter Hitchens and I were getting in March 2020. In those days, 93%, if YouGov is to be believed, 93% of people supported the first lockdown, 85% supported the second lockdown. Those figures have probably fallen a bit. But I think, I'm afraid what the lockdown both revealed and fueled, it both exposed and created this phenomenon, is that a lot of people in this country like being bossed around, or at least like everyone else to be bossed around. There is a slightly terrifying authoritarian streak. And even now, when you ask people about, closing nightclubs and stuff, years after the pandemic, you get a solid sort of 20 to 25% of the population saying, yes, ban everything, right? Ban everything that I happen not to use myself. And I can't help feeling that figure is higher as a result of the lockdown and the authoritarian impulses that it stoked. A perceived collective threat always makes people more tribal, more intolerant of any kind of eccentricity or outlying behavior, and keener to crack down on what is regarded as kind of dissent from the collective. And I'm afraid this is with us in politics for a long time to come. People just are much more demanding of the smack of firm government than they were in January 2020.
And another question that sort of occurred to me there is, well, obviously there's this great collective emotion about this, right? And as the pandemic petered out, a lot of the way that rage was almost channeled was into Partygate, and obviously the ongoing parties that did happen in Downing Street and things like that. And of course, but that was quite a strange dynamic there, wasn't it? It was almost as if the entirety, all the emotion and the difficulty and the hardship of the COVID years was kind of being put onto the fact that there were a few parties, and it was almost used as a psychological scapegoat. I mean, what did you make of that dynamic when really the thing people were angry about was the restrictions?
It was very striking that when you listened to how people complained about Partygate, the phrasing was almost always the same. It was almost always a variant of, I couldn't see my dying granny while people in Downing Street were doing this, right? And it was the first part that was really bothering them. But in the climate of that time, and for all the psychological reasons we've discussed, it was very difficult to admit that what was bothering you was a set of restrictions that on some level you already knew was excessive. And so you took out you were looking for someone on whom to take out your frustration. It's interesting that you use the word scapegoat. Really, I remember years and years ago, in this weirdly prophetic way, Boris wrote a column about the king must die, this kind of whole sort of Mary Renault thing. Some heroes, some of the guilty, some of the completely innocent. It doesn't really matter. The king must die. King must die. And how weirdly prophetic that was. As the country was at its most frustrated, he had the misfortune to come shambling, dishevelled into people's line of sight. And that's when the sickles come out and the barley has to be soaked with kingly gore, because we needed some release after what we on some level knew but could not admit to ourselves had been excessive restrictions. And the irony is that we aimed all of that at somebody who had been more sceptical than 95% of the population about the restrictions that had been imposed by the medical advisors.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point you raised there. I mean, I think you're probably right that Boris Johnson did have some libertarian instincts, but how do you think that ended up playing out? I mean, that sort of battle in government between the more libertarian side and the more restrictionist side, represented by sort of Chris Whitty and others.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, it's very, very easy to say this is all Boris's fault, because everything in the British Constitution always ends up being aimed at the person in charge. And that was obviously the view of all the people who were demonstrating outside Downing Street in 2021 and so on. Boris is about the most libertarian, certainly in this sense, leader that we've ever had or ever will have, right? People say he didn't believe in anything, and that's not true. The one absolute conviction he had all his life was not wanting to be bossed around, hating the nanny state. And so the mature question is, what does it say about the structures of state and the way in which politicians are subordinated to these bigger structures, that even someone like that ends up being carried along, maybe because he's being threatened with being personally liable or whatever it is. The easy and immature thing is to say, oh, it's all Boris's fault, I'd have done it differently. It's sort of James Delingpole critique, by the way, from someone who is quite pro-restrictions to start with, right? And I just think that critique either comes from a complete ignorance of how government works or a complete self-indulgence. The much more interesting and important question is, if before the pandemic you'd been asked to have the guy in number 10, who was the most resistant to this kind of thinking, you'd have picked Boris. If that didn't work, what does that say about the state of our quangocracy and about the relative impotence of the elected representative in the face of our unelected standing functionariat?
Okay, so that brings us on to wider questions of our government and politics, doesn't it? Okay, so you're a member of the House of Lords now. You're a Lord Temporal, so you've been there for 3 years, appointed. So you're not a hereditary peer. But there are Labour plans at the moment to abolish the remaining 92 hereditary peers. And, so what do you make of this? And I suppose more specifically, from what you've observed in the Lords, what do you think would be lost from the loss of these hereditary peers?
I mean, there'll be a huge loss if or when the hereditaries are removed. They are the people here who are the likeliest to see it as a job rather than as a reward or an honour. They accordingly take on all of the most unglamorous and unthanked workaday tasks. They sit on the committees that choose which contractor to put the new door in, or who to give the catering deal to, or whatever. And if they weren't there, that would all be entirely run by the permanent staff. They are the whips. They sit long hours without a penny in recompense, getting the business through. And the sad truth is that a lot of former ministers here just think they're way too grand to do that kind of thing, and so we will suffer a major loss in terms of the capacity of this House to do its scrutiny function. However, that isn't really the argument that I would use for retaining them, for opposing Labour's plan. I think there's a much bigger thing here, and it's about honesty and sticking to deals. You'll remember that, well, maybe you won't remember, but those who were not around can look up the passage of the legislation at the time and the speeches that were made. Blair came in 1997 with a commitment to get rid of the hereditaries and replace the House of Lords with a more democratic and representative upper chamber. William Hague, who was leader of the opposition at that time, didn't particularly defend the hereditary principle, but he worried that Labour would never get around to stage 2. Correctly, as it turned out. So he said, Tony he'll get rid of the hereds, and then he will have exclusive power to appoint his friends, and we will never get around to the elected. And of course, 25 years on, William Hague has been totally vindicated, right? As were the cynics in the upper house. So we've ended up in this weird situation where one of our 2 legislative chambers is appointed by the executive. Now, if that happened in Zimbabwe or somewhere, we'd all be harumphing about what an appallingly undemocratic system it was. The way in which that legislation went through, because remember that the Tory hereditaries were still the majority, they could have mauled it, blocked it, delayed it for a long time. The way in which it went through was that a deal was done. The then leader of the Lords, Viscount Cranborne, who's now the Marquess of Salisbury, said, we will not frustrate the reform if in return you allow some of us to stay here as guarantors that the eventual democratization will happen, right? And so when Labour or other supporters of reform say, it's irrational, it's indefensible, how can you have by-elections to have by-elections confined to other hereditaries and so on. It's supposed to be irrational, right? It's supposed to be uncomfortable. They are here precisely as the pebble in the shoe, the uncomfortable reminder that the promised reform was not delivered. And what's shocking about what Keir Starmer is doing is he's tapping the pebble out of the shoe without delivering the stage 2 reform that was promised back in 98, or indeed promised back in 1911. And so that's really what's outrageous about it. Now, I happen to favour an elected upper house. I would quite happily take my chances standing for election as a senator. But unless Labour is prepared to do that, I think it is outrageous to remove the only elected element from the upper house, albeit elected with a very restricted franchise, in order to give itself absolute and total control and to establish the principle that if you win a majority in the House of Commons, even if, as now, on a very minority vote, that you should have no opposition in either chamber. I think that really is quite a dangerous way of thinking.
Yeah, indeed. Could you just clarify for us what you said at the end there? What did you mean by elected on a minimal franchise?
So when a hereditary peer dies, there is an election among the other hereditary peers for who should take his place from the pool of eligible hereditary peers. Right. So in theory, that can carry on forever. And that's obviously, that really winds up the sort of rationalists on the other side. And I get it. It is a slightly bizarre system that you have an election confined to, children of, you're confined to barons and earls and viscounts and so on. However, the whole point was to keep that system there as the uncomfortable reminder. And that's why if Labour was serious about this, they would say, look, we'll have a royal commission, we'll look at proper reform. And I'm open to all sorts of arguments. Personally, I'm in favour of some kind of elected Senate, but they could have a regional house, they could have a house chosen by a different system, they could have a upper house chosen by lot. What you really can't do is say that the Prime Minister of the day gets to appoint one of the two legislative chambers. That really is the antithesis of democracy.
Yeah, and so I mean, the thing you indicated earlier was that this kind of system of having the upper house being entirely appointed is, the kind of thing that might go on in Zimbabwe. And I mean, what do you think are the drawbacks of having a second chamber that would be entirely by political appointment?
Well, the big drawback is that most appointed peers have emerged from the quangocracy or from the wider pool of the great and the good. And so that inculcates certain habits of mind. For example, because most of them have never really worked much outside the public sector, their first response to most situations is to spend more money. It's never to ask where the money is coming from. They tend to be very corporatist. They have a huge belief in experts rather than democracy. And of course, this made them fanatically anti-Brexit. One of the advantages of the hereditaries is that because there's a certain kind of randomization, they are a little bit more representative of the public. Some of them even voted for Brexit, maybe not a majority, but a hell of a lot more than of the appointed peers. And I think there is we have a problem enough, as we saw in lockdown, with these permanent bureaucracies being effectively outside democratic control. To give them half the legislature really is rubbing it in, right? So almost anything would be preferable to that system.
Okay, so, I mean, that seems to be a reform that Labour is pursuing in quite a dogmatic fashion there. I mean, not making the House of Lords more democratic, but simply abolishing the hereditary peers because they don't like them. And what have you made of Labour's start in government more broadly, then?
I've been astonished at quite how badly the Labour government has begun. As we record this interview, we're 8 weeks into the Labour government. I was expecting things to be bad, but I've been stunned by how far and how fast they've gone in the wrong direction. We knew some of the bad things they were going to do because they'd been flagged up before the election. So we knew that we would become the only country in Europe that doesn't treat education as a public good. Everywhere else in Europe, the attitude is, oh, great, you want to do this without requiring the taxpayer to do it? Thank you. How can we make that easier? Here, uniquely, we're punishing it. Uniquely. Funnily enough, something we're able to do because of Brexit. We knew that the non-DOMs would be driven away and that the rest of us, therefore, would be left to pick up the share of the tax bill of these departing plutocrats. And we knew that there would be a retrospective levy on oil and gas, which of course deters investment not only in energy but across the field. You can't expect to tax people after the event without there being a premium the next time somebody is thinking about opening a company, and sure enough, we've seen that happen. All right, we saw that coming. We did not foresee, no one had flagged up that they would scrap the free speech on campus legislation, the only free speech law passed by the previous government. No one foresaw that they would reverse the Gove, or indeed the Blair, because he started them, school reforms. No one foresaw that they would have some woke new national curriculum, that they would impose it even on academies and free schools, that they would make it harder to remove from the classroom or exclude disruptive pupils. No one saw that they would cancel all of the North Sea oil and gas. No one foresaw the whole kind of, you're not allowed to phone people outside working hours thing. I mean, the idea that you can do all of these things without there being an immediate and catastrophic impact on your growth is extraordinary. And I'm driven to the horrifying conclusion that they're not playing to the gallery. They're not doing anti-market things because there's a market for it, if you want, a political market for it. So it's always popular to say, we shouldn't let ticket masters sell expensive tickets to Oasis, or, we should require Next to pay retail workers more, or whatever. They genuinely don't understand that doing those things carries a cost. I think the country is going to be a lot poorer, a lot sooner than I'd ever imagined. I'd had this vague idea before the election that Labour could actually do one or two good things, like on healthcare or housing. Forget it. And so for that reason, I think this government may fall apart much earlier than expected. I currently don't see any likelihood that they get a second term. And at the rate we're going, they may struggle to get through the first one.
Okay, well, that brings us nicely on to our last question, doesn't it? So if Labour don't look like they're going to be getting a second term, the question is who's going to be replacing them at the next election? Of course, it's the Tory leadership contest at the moment, so there's 4 candidates still in, and they're going to be going to this sort of beauty pageant at the Tory party conference that's upcoming. Now, I know I won't be able to get you to endorse a particular candidate here, but for supporters of the Conservative Party, people on the right, what's the kind of thing they should be looking for in a prospective Conservative leader?
Yeah, I never wanted these leadership rules, and I have never since 2001 anticipated the MPs round. I take parliamentary sovereignty very seriously, so I always wait until I'm an ordinary member. I always wait until we get the final choice of 2, and then I say who I'm backing. I think it is important to remember that we're picking a leader of the opposition. So we can get absurdly hung up about policy. Would you scrap the VAT on school fees? Would you leave the ECHR? Whatever. Frankly, unless they're good at being leader of the opposition, all of that is irrelevant because they'll never get to BPM. And in any case, it's very hard to anticipate what the circumstances of the country will be at the next election and what people are going to be talking about and what should be in the manifesto. So I am less interested in what they say they would do as Prime Minister than in what they will do now as leader of the opposition. The last election revealed some appalling weaknesses in the Conservative Party's structures. Our membership is in collapse. The party is too embarrassed to admit the final figure. But I mean, we were like 260,000 members when David Cameron took over. I'm pretty sure we're under 100,000 now. Maybe a lot under. We'll see when we get the numbers from the leadership. We're out of money. CCHQ is having to lay off a lot of people. And our campaigning, our candidate selection was dreadful. It was late and it was shambolic. And our campaigning operation was just dreadful. I was writing a column during the election looking for arguments to vote Conservative, and occasionally, more in hope than expectation, I would turn to the party website, although, never know, the Conservatives might have 1 or 2 arguments for voting Conservative. Not a bit of it. All that we did during the campaign in terms of our material was boast about we've increased this budget and that budget. We're investing more in border security and we're investing more in adult learning. I mean, really? If you're reduced to putting price tags in your press releases, you're no good, right? And so someone needs to sort all of that out. I would vote for whichever candidate is most serious about getting on top of those issues. And actually, one rule of thumb, one nice sort of test of this: who would you have as your party chairman? It's the second most important job in opposition. It's got to be someone who commands the loyalty of the grassroots and is effective and has vision. I personally think it's quite difficult to combine that job with being an MP. So my candidate would be Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think he has the command of the affection of the party. I think he knows about fundraising, but above all, he knows about sorting out dilapidated organisations and making them efficient. So he would be my choice. And if one of the candidates promised to support him as chairman, that would certainly weigh with me.
Okay, Daniel Hannan, Lord Hannan of Kingsclere, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks, Laurie. Nice to talk to you.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.